this too. Yeah, okay. I just wanted to make sure you'd say that.
It is Tuesday, June 19th, 2007. My name is Herb Gronick, and I am talking with Lorraine Hoffmann as part of the video history project of the Milwaukee Jewish Historical Society. So I would like to start by finding out a little bit about you, your full name, when and where you were born.
My full name is Lorraine Hoffmann, Lorraine Lynn Hoffmann to be exact, and I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin at Columbia Hospital in August 1942.
Who were your first members of the family in this country, and when did they come and how?
My parents, along with my grandparents, came to this country in March of 1939 from Germany by boat, and basically escaping Nazi Germany, and came here because the Greenebaum family was a second cousin on my mother's side of the family, far relationships stretched, but close enough that they issued affidavits for my mother and her parents and her fiancé, my father, to come to this country.
When they came, how did your father make a living here, and what did he do?
Well, my father was a cabinet maker by trade from Germany, and therefore, again, since the Greenebaums brought him to this country, they provided him with a job at the North Side plant of the Greenebaum Tanning Company, which at the time was one of the largest tanning companies in the country. And he worked in the machine shop there. And I believe, if I recall his telling me correctly, he earned 40 cents an hour. And then, of course, in the evening, since he was a cabinet maker, he would fix furniture and earn another couple of dollars. And my mother took care of babies. Actually, first she, I think, scrubbed floors at the Jewish orphanage, which existed at that time. And then, from there she went to, taking care of babies and when they came home from the hospital with their mothers. And so that's basically what my parents did when they first came here.
What city did they come from in Germany?
They came from a town called Aurich, A-U-R-I-C-H, which is in Ostfriesland, which is in North Germany, near the Dutch border and the North Sea. And it was a small town, but fairly, percentage-wise high Jewish population. It was a town of about 6,000 people that had about 420 Jews. It would be considered, in today's lingo, they had a modern Orthodox synagogue there. They had a synagogue. It was Orthodox, but it was probably as close to what we would consider modern Orthodox today. And the small town, I remember my father saying, had probably 7 kosher butchers. And everyone almost made a living, but it was a government seat, and as I said, my parents, my mother's family was from the same town. They had a dry goods store in that town, and my father's family had a furniture factory.
Were they wealthy?
No, they were middle class. Most of these people were basically middle class. Did they have help in the house? Sure, because people had that at the time. They weren't wealthy, but they had someone that did cleaning. And so when my mother washed floors at the Jewish orphanage here, she had never washed floors before in her life. Even so, they were not wealthy. This was, they were middle class people that had been in the town. The Hoffmann family had been in that town since late 1600s. There was a Jewish community in that town. I have a book at home on the Jewish community of Aurich from 1650-ish to 1945. There are no Jews there currently, but the Jewish community existed there all those years.
Did they belong to a synagogue there in Germany?
Oh, of course. This wasn't even a matter. This was a matter in Germany. When my father first came here, he's talked about when he saw bowling alleys and kitchens and synagogues, this shocked him. because this didn't exist, or that synagogues were social centers. In Germany, where you had church and state not combined, were combined versus separate, as in this country, everyone belonged to a synagogue or church. And if they didn't, when they wanted to be buried, they had to pay back dues, because otherwise they couldn't even have been buried. So this was automatic. But my father, would have been, was involved. My grandparents were involved in the synagogue there on both sides of the family anyhow.
I'm going to ask you about your involvement here in the Jewish community.
Okay, I was just going to make the transition. So when my, in terms of when my parents first came here, because of their involvement in the synagogue in Germany, when my parents first came here, and as I said, they were what you'd call modern Orthodox. They were not comfortable in a Reform setting. And they also, the Eastern European shtibels that were on the west side where they davened was also not what they were used to. They were used to choir, men's choir. They were used to a more formal service. So for the high holidays, my parents immediately joined Beth Israel, which Rabbi Baumerin's synagogue on Teutonia Avenue, which was Orthodox. But there were a lot of people that came with the same time my parents did, who were more religious and just had no place to go, felt uncomfortable on both ends. And my father started high holiday services, and for 10 years he organized and ran the high holiday services for what was then the New Home Club, which was a group of German Jews that came over at that time. And until 1956, when he decided, okay, you've been here long enough, now it's time for you to have found the right affiliation. I'm not just running services in order that people have an excuse not to pay membership dues to a synagogue. So that's when he ran the services through 1955, and
Can you tell us a little more about the New Home Club as you remember and as your parents told you?
Sure. The New Home Club was started probably in the early to mid 30s by people whom, and again, I can't give you those names. It was clearly a while before my parents came, but it was a social club for people who just came over, where they could go, they could meet other people in the same boat as they were, basically immigrants, and where they could socialize. I think a lot of shidduchs were made through the New Home Club of, I'm thinking off the top of my head, name that we all know, Ernie Flersheim, Rick Flersheim's parents, I think Ernie came from Frankfurt, and I forget where Inge came from, but they met at the New Home Club. And there were many others like that, and then later on, as I said, my father started the high holiday services in 1946, and later on we also had the second Seder that was conducted, and my father organized it, was conducted by Dr. Herman Weil, who was professor at the university and also had ran the Sunday school and educational department at Temple Emmanuel at the time, and we ran that through for many years in order to do that. But and then eventually there really wasn't that much. People assimilated, and they joined synagogues in different directions, from Emmanuel to Bethel to many others, and I don't know. It basically folded. I think the last thing that I recall the New Home Club doing was about 40 years ago, when they raised money for ambulances during the Six-Day War. So, but by that time, people were basically settled into the Milwaukee Jewish community.
Did the children remain friends?
We see each other ever so often, but not really. They moved. They moved to different parts of the country. There weren't that many. The total critical mass wasn't great enough to do anything. In other cities, like in Chicago, where you had a larger critical mass of German Jewish immigrants, more so, because they had a congregation, had a couple of congregations, a couple of conservative ones as well as an Orthodox one in Chicago that eventually merged. But they, so there were more people, and more of them stayed in the city. And I know my cousin who lives in Chicago is friendly with a number of the children, contemporaries who also came over. But in Milwaukee, my friends that I knew through there, one lives in Colorado, and the other one lives in Florida, and the third one lives, so they're all over the place.
What was the involvement of your parents in the community besides the fact that your father was involved with giving services?
After my father stopped that, he became involved. We joined Bethel, which was a conservative synagogue on the west side, on Sherman Boulevard, and my father became very active there. He was on the board of directors there, and so he was very involved in Bethel Ner Talmud, and as a matter of fact, he was the one that found the land for Bethel in Mequon when it came time that the neighborhood was changing on Sherman Boulevard, and they were looking to move out north where the Jewish community had moved. My father actually was the one who found the land and got it for Bethel, and then of course helped in the, I think he actually sold the building to the church that's there now. So he was very deeply involved in the operations there.
In anything besides Bethel?
Well, it was involved in the Federation, and the ABCs of Jewish Community Organization in Milwaukee was involved in some level in a number of those, Israel Bonds and Federation, but primarily through Bethel. And again, he was also earning a living and building a business during this time, so there was a limit to the amount of time that he could spend on this.
You said he was a cabinet maker, and how did he get from being a cabinet maker into the business that he evolved?
How did he get from there to making shoe polish?
Yes.
Well, while he was at the Greenebaum Tanning Company, a rhinoceros died at the Milwaukee County Zoo. And now, how does that get from one to the other? Well, they tanned the hide at the Greenebaum Tanning Company, and one of the old tanners that was there came to my father in the machine shop and asked him if he would please cut out a few trivets on the equipment that he had there out of this hide so he could make an ashtray or something out of it. And so my father did that, and a couple of weeks later, this old codger gave my father a bottle of white shoe polish. He said, "Here, this is for your baby. That's me." And my father took it and brought it home, gave it to my mother, and never gave it another thought. And about a week or two after that, my mother said to him, "Gee, that white shoe polish you brought was really good." And my father said something to the effect of, "Manishtana, what makes this white shoe polish any better from any other white shoe polish? Oh, this one didn't come off. The other one's all chalked off." So that was the beginning where my father sold the polish, and the other person made it, and then later on, things developed in such a way that they separated, and my father started his own business. My mother made the shoe polish then, and my father went on the road and sold it.
Tell the story of how she made the shoe polish.
Well, she boiled the waxes. We had our factory at that time on Thomas Avenue, 2018 East Thomas, and I went to, I was going to Hartford Avenue grade school, and for lunch I would go to the factory. My mother would, I would have lunch with my mother, but in between times she would have to get on a step ladder because she was 4'11", and order to pour the boiling water into the cooking wax and make the emulsion. So that's my mother did that for many years until actually a friend came from their hometown, from Aurich, came from Israel, and then he took over and made it, but he couldn't trust anyone else because the only thing we really had was the formulation that this product was better. So my mother and my father built that business together. And
what was your involvement in Jewish organizations as a young girl?
Very little. I went to the East Side Hebrew School. Again, we lived on the East Side. I was kind of like in between two worlds because my friends who went to grade school with me, Hartford Avenue Grade School and Riverside High School, who lived on the East Side, were primarily Reformed. And we were more traditional, conservative traditional. So I went to the East Side Hebrew School, which it started out in the basement of Temple Emmanuel, and then later on moved over to Oakland Avenue 4200 block of Oakland. There's a little building that looks like an old church because it was, and is now, I think, houses Shorewood Press and a couple of other places in there. That's where the Eastside Hebrew School moved to. And that was my Jewish background. Then later on, I went to Sunday school at Bethel and was confirmed at Bethel. And that was really my involvement in the Jewish community. Beyond, we basically kept a traditional home and had Shabbos at home every Friday night. And my father always made, when we made Shabbos was, differed. I mean, it was usually around 7 o'clock. If Shabbos was at 5 or if Shabbos was at 9, we made Shabbos at 7 o'clock. And it was more of a family-based situation.
Were you involved in any Jewish clubs or the BBYO or anything of that nature?
No, I really wasn't. I really became more involved in the Jewish organizations since I have come back to Milwaukee, because I lived in Chicago for 30 years and was with Merrill Lynch in Chicago, where I was a stockbroker for, as I said, until I took my retirement June 30th of '01. And I basically was involved in secular community organization type of stuff there, ranging from working with the police department to community groups and zoning matters and that sort of thing. I was not involved in the Jewish community there.
Have you had any involvement in non-Jewish organizations here in the city?
Yes. In addition to my involvement with Lake Park Synagogue, which I started going to after my father passed away, which is a little over 7 years ago, in order to say Kaddish. And we started going there because his doctor and our neighbor said, why don't you come with us to say Kaddish? It's closer. And my mother and I started going to Lake Park in 2001, or 2000 I should say, and the rest is history there. I've been involved now as president for about 3.5 years. And I'm active I'm on the board of the Wisconsin Institute for Torah Study. But I also, in terms of the non-Jewish community, which you asked about, I'm on the board of the Goethe House of Milwaukee German Cultural Society. I'm on the board of the Milwaukee School of Engineering. And I'm on the board of the Museum of Beer and Brewing. So I have tried to balance my life.
How did you become involved in diverse involvement in such matters?
I think each one was I had been involved in these secular activities anyhow, and I am not one to stay at home and look at walls. So I, enjoy being active and actively involved in things. But in the case of Goethe House, Ted Wiedemeyer happens to be the president of that, and is a friend of, I know him through our neighbor, Judge Barron, and invited me to that, and frankly through that is how I was asked to be on the board of the Milwaukee School of Engineering. And another friend of my father's, Carl Strauss, who passed away just this last December, whom a lot of people I know was the brewmaster at the Pabst Brewing Company for many years. And he's the one that got me involved in the Museum of Beer and Brewing. He said, you put stuff in bottles also. What's the difference? You put shoe polish in bottles. We put beer in bottles. Why don't you get involved? They could use your help. So that's how I got involved in the Museum of Beer and Brewing, was through our friend Carl Strauss.
Can you backtrack a little bit about
Yeah.
after you graduated from high school and went off to college and became a stockbroker? How did all that happen?
Well, I worked in Madison for a year after I graduated from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I worked there for a year and then went to graduate school in New York, where I got a degree in teaching of social science and history, and decided, my undergraduate degree was in economics, and decided that I really couldn't deal with public school systems. They were just, monstrosities that I couldn't deal with, and I was really interested in going into the business world. And yet, at that time, it was not necessarily that feasible for a woman to do. So I ended up coming back from New York to Chicago, which was kind of like a halfway in between New York and Milwaukee, which was a little bigger city, and yet it was close to Milwaukee. And I started doing research for a small brokerage house there, and got registered in the process, and then became a stockbroker pretty much on my own. At that time, I had to guarantee what was then Goodbody and Company, which was later taken over by Merrill Lynch, that they didn't have to pay me anything. I mean, they still were not hiring women for this. That if they just paid me commissions, that's all they had to do. So they had no out-of-pocket cost. So that's why they hired me. And then later, when Merrill took over Goodbody, after going through that same exercise once more, because they still weren't interested in women at that time. We're talking about the late 60s, early 70s, and it was really not that common. In the meantime, some of the biggest producers at Merrill Lynch and other companies are women. A good friend of mine from my office, who's now in my office, Sharon Oberlander, is I think one of the top 3 producers in the country, not only for Merrill, but she's a Jewish woman from Winnipeg, Canada, who works in our office in Chicago.
How do you connect to Israel?
I guess I always have. I mean, starting out with when I was going to the East Side Hebrew School, we actually, again, I started the East Side Hebrew School in 1949. We were taught Ivrit and Sephardic rather than the Ashkenazi Hebrew that we, later on, about two and a half years later, they decided, well, maybe they're not going to Israel and they're going to need this to pray here at synagogue, so they kind of changed us. So my Hebrew kind of goes both ways. There's some things that I still do in the Sephardic, but so we were, taught from early on to, buy stamps to put on the trees for, plant trees in Israel, to just being a longtime supporter of the state of Israel.
And one of the other things that would be of interest is what do you see as the future of the Milwaukee Jewish community?
I think the Milwaukee Jewish community has, a lot of, potential and future, and I think that, I think it, along with the rest of Milwaukee, needs to sell itself, because I think that once people spend a little bit of time here, they really like it. But our problem is convincing these people to come here in the first place. Once they get here, they realize what a treasure there is, both in Milwaukee and the Milwaukee Jewish community. But I think we need to do some outreach to bring some more people here.
Well, it's very interesting, and particularly towards the Milwaukee Jewish community. And Milwaukee Jewish community is part of the greater Milwaukee community in itself, and you feel that the community, the Jewish community, is on a step forward, or are they standing still, or do they need a lot of help?
I think all of the above. I mean, in terms of population, I think for all intents and purposes, the Milwaukee Jewish population has been, give or take, 25,000 for as long as I can remember. So I think that it's pretty much population-wise standing still. Certainly construction-wise it's not, but that's another story.
One of the questions they have on here, and I don't know where it comes from. Frankly.
Okay, all right.
What are you most proud of in your life?
What am I most proud of in my life? I don't know. I'm not. Obviously, I'm pleased to be able to, thanks in part to what I've done in my career with Merrill Lynch, as well as what my father was able to, do in terms of business, that it has enabled me to be fairly generous to a number of Jewish institutions, and I especially am focusing on local ones, Milwaukee ones, because again, we do not have the critical mass to call on that you have on a national scale. So while supporting some national institutions in the state of Israel and that, I have been trying to focus on some of our local institutions that need help, and I'm glad to be able to do that.
Do you have anything that specifically you would say that you have been proud of being a part of the Milwaukee Jewish community, that would be a highlight of something?
I don't know. I mean, you know,
It's not a question that you have to move aside from modesty and really let loose on things. It's a hard one.
well, as said, I've been fortunate. I've been blessed to be able to, have some assets that I've been able to, give to some of the Milwaukee institutions, if it's Lake Park Synagogue or if it's the WITS, the Yeshiva, and some other organizations. And I think, that basically, makes me feel good that I'm able to do that, and, that I've been blessed to do that.
Well, these are the things, and some of the things that we do are influential with other people coming in and doing parts that they probably need a little shove to get involved in, so that they aren't just bystanders.
Right.
And these are the kind of things that we kind of look for to say, you are responsible for some of those things, and possibly through your work with the Lakeside,
Oh, yeah.
it has opened up avenues that other people might
Right.
not have taken.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, my experience with the, Lakeview Citizens Council, which is a secular organization in Chicago that I'm involved in, I learned a lot, and I have applied a number of those things to working, trying to get the synagogue to do things. If it was last night at 1 o'clock when I sent an email to the yeshiva and said, how about these, getting some pictures out to some press, not only in Milwaukee about the graduates, but to some of the other cities, to Toronto, Detroit, and San Diego, where there have been some graduates, so that they can put it in their Jewish press. This is something, that's, I didn't create this. I'm not such chachma. I learned that basically at the Lakeview Citizens Council, where sometimes we had to do things, as my friend said, with smoke and mirrors. But these are some things that we need to do in the Jewish community.
I have a question about what you've learned being a woman who is kind of fighting being a woman in an unfriendly atmosphere at Merrill Lynch, or is it Goodbody? Is that
Goodbody came,
Goodbody,
yeah.
and then Merrill Lynch, and then now, and then being a woman business owner. What were some of the experiences, or did you find that just by force of will you were able to do what you wanted to do?
Yes and no. I think that there were definitely some problems in terms of at Merrill Lynch. The biggest problem I would say was with women customers that felt that they couldn't really trust another woman since they were housewives, and therefore they didn't know anything about finances. How could this other woman know anything about it? They wanted to talk to some man regardless, So I think, you had to overcome those obstacles. And, obviously, a number of us have done that. As I said, my friend Sharon Oberlander more than I have, because she's one of the top producers in the country. But I think, these are things that are constantly, they're obstacles, but they're just obstacles to be overcome. And I guess as an only child, and my father's son as well as daughter, because there was never any question in my father's mind that I could do anything. There was, if it had to be done, you did it. He did it. I mean, he was, he didn't ask people to do things. If it was, cleaning the toilets of the factory, or if it was doing something, mechanical, he did it. So, I mean, it was kind of like, I was told, well, of course you can do it. I mean, if I can do it, you can do it. So I kind of grew up with this, if I can do it, you can do it type of thing, and therefore I never really questioned that I could, that I was able to do it. I had to overcome some obstacles of getting hired, but there's never, I never doubted it, I guess.
Did he expect you to take over the business?
Yes. Oh, yeah. I mean, if I wanted to, and I did. And in fact, the last week of his life, he wrote a letter saying that effective January 1st, I would be running the business and so forth, and it was very correct because he stopped breathing on December 31st, but he was in his office until 2 days before then, so running the business.
In your early life as a student, whether it be in grade school, high school, or college, and then in your business life, did you come across anti-Semitism?
Yes, especially the 1 year that I worked in Madison. After I graduated from college, I worked in Madison for a year, and I worked for the telephone company in their management training program. And I clearly remember that, now, part of it was that I don't think they were ready for college graduates, even so they thought they did. I mean, most of the people that worked there were not college graduates. And I don't know how much of it was anti-Semitism or how much was just that they, didn't want someone like me, Jewish or non-Jewish. But one of the things that my boss told me when I would have been ready to leave anyhow, but they said, I think you need find another job, was that I had brought matzah to the office on Passover. I said, oh, really? So yes, this was, that was where I was confronted with it most directly, was at the telephone company that time in Madison right after college.
Any time after, while you were with Merrill Lynch or anything of that type?
Not that I'm aware of. Not really.
And the other thing I'll ask you very directly, is there anything we forgot to ask you? Or we should have asked you?
Do you want to talk at all about your involvement with the Federation here?
I have been involved on, just on, on an ongoing basis. Frankly, I've been involved, because I was living in Chicago. I have been a member of the Federation. When I first went to Chicago to work there, I was involved with the, young, what did they call it? Young Leadership Division? Whatever they call it in Chicago. I'm not sure that that's exactly what it is. Is that what the name is there? And I was involved there, and I made a lot of friends through there, actually, who later became, some of them became my customers. So I just, I immediately got involved with the Federation in Chicago when I moved to Chicago, and I've been a contributor to the Chicago Federation for over 25 years because of that, and I've been, contributing here basically since I've been back here, but here more in the contributor level, and in the tail end years in Chicago also as a contributor. Rather than being involved personally, but I was involved personally in the early years when I was involved with the Young Leadership Division down there.
You seem to move rather easily between the different movements of Judaism, here, at least here in Milwaukee. Do you have anything to say about that, or about how it is in Milwaukee?
I guess because I was raised somewhere in the middle. I was raised as a traditional conservative Jew, and I say that more to the right of what we would consider conservative Judaism today. While a lot of our friends were Reformed, and our service was, our conservative service at Bethel was basically the same as the Lake Park or modern Orthodox service, aside from the Mechitza. Therefore, I guess I feel comfortable in all of the above, and have friends in all of the above. And also, I think one of the things that I also have a lot of non-Jewish friends. Not only friends that I went to school with, non-Jewish people on the east side, or some that are still there, our neighbors. I recall when my mother was in the hospital at Columbia, shortly before she passed away in 2001. Rabbi Fine, who was then the rabbi of Lake Park Synagogue, commented to me once, Lorraine, every time I've been to visit your mother, and he came almost every day, one of your non-Jewish neighbors is there, or non-Jewish friends. It's just that, we're just very close to, and my parents, quite frankly, this may be part of the German background, my parents were very close to non-Jewish neighbors in Germany. And when I've been there, they had a reunion in my parents' hometown in 1992, that I went to with my parents, And then later again in 2002, after my parents had passed away, they dedicated a monument for those Jews of the town that had died in the Holocaust. Their non-Jewish friends were there, showing me around, showing some of the other people around, especially, I recall there was one couple that came in 2002 where this Henry Sampson's parents, they fled to Belgium. His parents were both killed in Auschwitz, and he was an orphan, he was an orphan at the end of the war, and ended up with some relatives in New York. So he went back to his hometown. He didn't know anything. He was a child. I knew more about that town and who lived where, having been born in Milwaukee, than he did, because I'd been there with my parents. But some of my mother's non-Jewish neighbors and friends, came and showed us around and could tell him as well as me about who lived where and what they did and how they knew them, and that they were friends with them and so forth. He learned more about his father from the non-Jewish people that were still alive there, who knew his father, than he had known before.
I have one more question. Were your parents affected by Kristallnacht in their town?
Oh, yes.
And did they tell you about it?
Oh, yes. My parents, as I said, came here in March 1939, so 10th of November 1938. Kristallnacht, my parents were in Germany, and again, my parents weren't married, but they had been going together for like 10 years. They lived around the corner from each other, so they were very close. You just couldn't get married and establish a household in that environment. My grandmother, who had heart failure and was in bed, my father's mother, called my father to say, "What's going on out there?" She saw some flickering going on outside. And when he opened the window to see what was going on, and this was one of these French windows that opened out, an SS man on the street shot at my father. The bullet hit this 1/4-inch window pane, ricocheted up to the ceiling, and then fell on my grandmother's bed. The first time when we were there in 1959, first time my parents went back, we went to the house was still standing, and my father asked the people if he could please go upstairs with me, and he took me upstairs to the bedroom, and he said, "May I now open the window up?" And he opened the window, and of course the bullet hole was still there. And he said, "Now look at the ceiling," and that hole was still in the ceiling. These things don't get fixed that fast. So I had a very first-hand experience there. But then later on, when the Jews were all rounded up and put on trains to concentration camp, they sent the women back first. So my mother was able to go back first. They sent the older people. So my grandfather, in fact, my grandfather on my father's side wasn't old enough to be sent back, but they recognized that he should go home anyhow, and they sent him home, be with your wife. They knew that my grandmother was sick. And so my uncle and my father were on the train to concentration camp. My uncle was an MD, and he cleaned himself up, and he went to the SS men and said, "I've got a few patients on this train that aren't going to make it." My father was 5'10" and weighed 130 pounds. He said, "Start coughing, you've got TB," which was, of course, not true, but it was good enough to save his life. And they stopped the train, and they shipped my father and the school teacher of the town back and said, "Go home." And one of the reasons my uncle went on to concentration camp, and he got out when he was able to come to this country. But one of the main reasons was that my grandmother needed injections or medication because she was so sick. So, but my father didn't quite make it to concentration camp on the 10th of November. But yes, they were there and they saw the synagogues burning, and my uncle eventually made it out. The difficult part was getting into this country. And I think I mentioned that my parents came 2 weeks after my uncle, aunt, and my grandparents because they got a visitor's visa. And I just explained this to this gentleman at my house an hour ago, so I don't want to repeat myself. But my uncle and my aunt, my grandparents couldn't get visas. My parents got the visa from the Greenebaums. My mother, my father, and my mother's parents. My uncle had been a ship's doctor and got some money out of Germany to some relatives in New York, and they gave a visa. They wouldn't have had the money they had to prove that they aren't going to be. Incidentally, we can keep this in mind when we're talking about immigration bill right now. But this was how they had to prove that they wouldn't be a burden on society. And then my grandmother, because she was sick, couldn't get into the country. They wouldn't give a visa. They weren't going to leave my grandmother there, so they took they carried her up to the second floor of the American consulate in Hamburg, and to apply for a visitor's visa. And when they got there, the German men in the American consulate first said, we just got a letter. We're not allowed to issue any more visitors' visas. And they saw that my father and my uncle just died on the spot. They weren't going to leave their mother there. And he looked at him again. He said, who said the mail always has to come on time? Maybe I didn't get this letter until tomorrow. And he issued the visitor's visa then. My grandmother ended up actually dying in New York Harbor as they were getting ready to get off the boat. And my father always used the example that it was like Moses not quite making it to the promised land, but he got his children out. And that's sort of my grandma, they would never have left my grandmother there, but she never quite made it, but she got her children out. But, as a matter of fact, I was in Washington last week, Tuesday and Wednesday with the Orthodox Union and the Mission, and one at the tail end when we met at the White House, or the Executive Office building with Tony Snow and a man by the name of Jeremy Katz, who was one of the liaisons, and they talked about the immigration bill. I happened to have in my pocket a letter. It was a draft of a letter, an unsigned letter, that some farmer here in Wisconsin had written on behalf of my mother's father's nephew and niece that were farmers. They were cattle dealers. They had something to see if they would be able to get them out. Of course they didn't. They never got visas because there were farm visas that you could go on, that they had many more slots for farm workers, and they could, but they were killed, so they never made it out. But I handed them a copy of that for whatever it was worth. So, but anyhow, yes, my parents were very much there on Kristallnacht, and my father was definitely one for letting people know what happened. He did not, sometimes immigrants fall into two categories, those that don't want to talk about it and those that do talk about it, and he always believed in talking about it, that people needed to know.
Well, these sections are one of the reasons, and it's a reason for a historical society, because things like this should be recorded,
right,
and kept on file.
Absolutely.
For posterity,
right,
because so many people today don't know about these things, and they have no connection to it at all.
Right.
So, Lorraine, we thank you very much for interviewing with us, and we shall see that it's all going to be recorded. Okay,
well, thank you, Mr. Gronick. Thank you, Jane Avner. Thank you, Patricia, for doing this. It'll be very worthwhile, and I look forward to seeing other people's histories as well. And
are we still on?
Yes, we're still on.
Yeah.
Okay, we thank you for coming in today.
Thank you.